I'm a god.
Well, what if there is no tomorrow?
I'm a god.
There wasn't one today.
Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of It's Time to Rewind, a podcast stuck in its own time loop right along with the movies we discuss. In this season, we're taking a look at Groundhog Day after day, after day, after day, after day. I'm your host, Bubbawheat from Flights, Tights, and Movie Nights, and in this episode we are discussing Phil's fourth February 2nd, Groundhog Day, that starts at 34 minutes and 33 seconds, with Phil waking up excited to see the morning in his room, asks Miss Lancaster if anyone was looking for him, gives her a kiss, and ends at 38 minutes and 46 seconds, with Phil asking Nancy a series of questions about her high school English class. Today my guest is Jess from French Toast Sunday. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. This is going to be an interesting section of Phil's Groundhog Day. But before we get to the actual movie, let me ask you, what's your experience with time loop movies and time loop episodes in general?
I feel like I've seen a good bit of them. I have definitely many that come to mind, and also there's different variations on the time loop genre where they're not necessarily the Groundhog Day format, but other types of time travel setups that aren't just like the strictly going back to one time and back and forward, like Back to the Future style. So I really enjoy these types of movies that have different plays on time. I know there's a lot of TV shows that have done this type of format, like I'm a big fan of Buffy, so that one definitely came to mind. But I'm very intrigued by these types of movies.
Yeah, obviously so am I. And I think in terms of the time loop structure, I think this day in particular is an interesting section of the time loop. Because for a little while here, this is where Phil decides to use the freedom from consequence that you get in a time loop for his own personal gain. And I mentioned the 5 stages of grief earlier that he went through quickly in a single day, but I think in the larger scheme of things, this is definitely the bargaining stage of grief. Are you familiar with the 5 stages of grief?
Yeah. I think that is like a great way to look at how he handles the situation. And I agree, it's kind of that time where he's like, well, if I have to be in this situation, let me see how I can make the best of it.
Right. This is the first time where he actually skips some of the milestones, because one big feature of time loops are the milestones that we can recognize as the days are repeating.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically, he skips the man at the top of the stairs that he calls Pork Chop, and he also completely skips his Groundhog Day broadcast.
Yeah, I feel like we've gotten to the point at this time in the movie where the audience definitely remembers all of the beats that we've hit each time. So it really pays off in like the ways that he reacts to those similar beats. It's like a really fun section of the movie.
Yeah, and of course, the first thing that we see is going through some of the classic sins. Like he starts off with the sin of gluttony by going to the Tip Top Cafe and just having this veritable smorgasbord of pastries.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those like fantasy fulfillment things where it's like, ooh, what if you could go have like try everything on the menu? Because like, what does it matter at this point when in reality no one ever does that?
Yeah, and he's really taken advantage of the fact that his body. I mean, he doesn't know for sure that his body is fully going to reset every day, but he does mention the fact that he doesn't even have to floss anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely is that time where he's like a little gleeful about not having to do those daily, like tedious tasks that you just kind of, and like niceties with people that you have to do because normally there's consequences when you don't brush your teeth or, when you punch the guy you went to high school in the face. Like these are things you can not normally get away with.
Yeah, and I think I will say that, you brought up the punch of him just flat out decking Ned Ryerson as soon as he walks up, not even letting him get into his whole insurance pitch. But that is the happiest I've ever seen somebody to punch somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah, if there was a list of like great movie punches, that's got to be like one of the tops cuz like I said, at this point you've seen Ned be very annoying and Tobolowsky plays that role so well. He really is just above and beyond like aggravating. And for him to get punched, it's like it's very effective and funny.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that there was actually an early draft of the script, and that scene with him punching Ned Ryerson was originally going to be the first scene of the movie, complete with the whole voiceover, and it was just like a little bit short of the whole needle scratch freeze frame. I bet you're wondering how I ended up in this situation.
Yeah. Yeah. I I of course, like, you don't know how you would react if that was how the movie was structured. I feel like I like how it actually is structured more just because, I don't know, developing it like with the character, like learning it as the character goes is
Mhm.
it's it's a fun way to watch the movie, but definitely dropping into the middle of it. It's Palm Springs kind of takes that approach. And um in that one, it feels very effective, but I feel like knowing that it's doing a similar thing to Groundhog Day, it felt more fresh doing that.
Yeah, I really think it's more effective in this movie, especially because the whole concept of this specific time loop is about Phil growing as a person. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not about him overcoming some sort of thing that's been done to him, where in that situation, it can be more effective to start in the middle. But since it really is more about Phil developing as a person, it's better to see his development go from beginning all the way through to the end.
Yeah, and I also feel like how I was saying, we've seen this character be so aggravating. If you just were dropped in the middle and all of a sudden you just see Bill Murray punch this guy and you're like, what is this? Like you wouldn't get the same payoff as you get with like seeing that character over and over again.
Yeah, that is a good point because that is an odd place to start. I would almost think that it would make more sense if they did end up doing something like that. It would make more sense to have something happen to Phil, where Phil is the one being the victim, and then
Mm.
you'll because that gives you a bit more sympathy for the main character. But in this situation, you're starting in the middle, and you're seeing bad Phil basically, and then we go back to the beginning, and he's still bad Phil because that's where he starts. And we don't see any change in his personality. In fact, he like at that point he's actually gotten worse before he starts to get better.
Yeah, I think ultimately it's structured in the best way to tell this particular story.
Hmm. And another thing that I noticed in terms of the repetition, besides him punching Ned Ryerson, this is the first time that he doesn't actually step in the giant puddle. And on top of that, I could be wrong because I'm actually watching the loops as they're coming. I haven't actually gone back and watched the film from start to finish again recently. But I believe that this is actually the last time that he that the puddle comes into play. I think the puddle goes away, and even though it's still early in his development, and like we just said, he's actually getting worse at this point rather than getting better. But that is one just little part where he actually improves his day and learns from the past repetitions in order to better his day overall.
Yeah, but like speaking of like him kind of getting worse as a person during this segment of the movie, it's not just that he doesn't step in it, he lets someone else step in it. So I feel like that's kind of meaningful in a way that it's like he's kind of giddy at the fact that someone else was the one that stepped into it, not him. When like if it was like a real like personal learning moment, he would have also stopped that guy from stepping in the puddle.
Right, and that's, he also really feels like he's echoing Ned Ryerson at that moment, because the first two times that he steps in the puddle, Ned Ryerson is right there, and he gets that extreme glee at seeing Phil step in the puddle. Like,
yeah.
Oh, watch that step. It's a doozy. And then going back to the diner scene with Rita, we actually get a little bit more personality from Rita. And we get her just randomly spouting poetry, where she goes into Sir Walter Scott, full on, just out of nowhere. The wretch consented all in self, living shall forfeit fair renown, and doubly dying shall go down to the vile dust from whence he sprung, unwept, unhonored, and unsung, complete with all the dramatic pauses and everything. And that feels like, to me, it's like the more prestigious version of working movie quotes into day-to-day life.
Yeah, for sure, because it's like, it's such a ridiculous thing to do, to like quote something, especially something that long. It's not like it was a one-line thing. Like, that is a lot to remember, that whole poem. And I don't think it necessarily makes Rita seem like
the better person.
Yeah. She seems very pretentious when she says that. But it is very funny.
Yeah, and also it's not fully fitting with her oeuvre, because this is Scottish poetry, and she keeps talking about how she majored in French poetry. So this is like a little bit of her flexing, it feels like. But at the same time, I think that Phil actually flexes back, because he actually responds, because the poem itself is about the dangers of narcissism, and about this person who was so self-centered, but then whenever he died, that no one cared. And Phil actually comments on the fact, like, what are you saying, that I'm self-centered? It's funny. He presents it in a funny way, but I think at the same time, it's actually telling that he is an intelligent man that is able to hear this poem and understand the meaning behind it, rather than just all this random poetry.
Yeah, even though he's pretty snarky about it, I think it does kind of hint in like the deeper level that they might be able to connect later on.
Right, and we'll get into this a bit later, but I think that the film just completely skips over that. But I think this is really kind of the first hint at a connection between them, like a real connection between them.
Yeah, it's definitely getting that like push and pull aspect of that's like very popular in like romantic comedies, of kind of being frustrated with each other. Like, he sees her as this like a little over the top positive but like pretentious person, and then she just sees him as a total ass, which is like definitely not unreasonable of her to think that.
Yeah, based on everything that she's seen from him.
Yeah, so they're definitely like two personalities that are not going to get along at this point.
On his way out of the diner, he stops and talks to Nancy and starts asking her random questions. So, I mean, I really have to ask you, because whenever I was scheduling guests for this podcast in general, I realized that, I've got a lot of guys here. Like, I really got to get a woman's perspective on some of these. But if a guy just randomly asked you your name out of the middle of nowhere, would you tell him your full name or just your first name?
Oh, no, I would definitely only say my first name, and I probably wouldn't even want to do that. Like, I probably would, just out of, like, social politeness, and, maybe they do know me somehow, or, whatever the case may be. But I would absolutely not hand over my last name. That actually stood out to me. I was like, I think I can tell that a guy wrote that line.
Yeah. It's like she's just, there's a little bit of trepidation. She's like, what's this for? But then she just happily gives, where she went to high school and the name of her high school teacher's name without hardly any hesitation.
Yeah, if this took place during, like, present time, I would think he was trying to get the answers to, like, the security questions to get into her bank account or Facebook or something.
Yeah, and what's the last 3 digits on the back of your credit card?
Yeah, I feel like watching this, I did kind of think that it was, like, if I was in her shoes, I might think that he was about to be like, oh, I recognize you from high school. So it doesn't seem like completely crazy to go down that line. But then the fact that he just, after that, just leaves it there and gets up and walks away, I would be very concerned after that.
Mm-hmm. I definitely feel a little sorry for Nancy, and even more coming up here in as the movie goes on. She's a character that's, I think Phil is at the point where he's starting to view people, even like he's always from what we've seen, just sees other people as kind of a means to an end. But I think even more so right now, he's really just seeing the people, especially in this town, as just objects, and that, like, not really personalizing with them at all.
For sure. Yeah, he's kind of, at this point, it's like almost he's the first player in a video game, and no one else is really real to him anymore. Because certain things that there's movie logic, and then there's, you can go into the real world implications of that. But like something like him kissing the B&B owner is like very funny, but it's also like, that would be crazy for that to happen to that woman.
Mm-hmm.
And she kind of was a little, taken by him, so maybe she wouldn't have minded so much. But then you can kind of get a little cynical and be like, no, you really shouldn't just be going around kissing people on the lips like that. In the context of the movie, it's definitely a funny moment, though.
Yeah, I think you're right. And this, in other types of time loop movies, you get more of a video game feel to it, especially like Edge of Tomorrow. But I do think that there is a video game element, like you just said, where all the non-main characters are like NPCs.
Yeah, and like something like that Airbnb owner, it's, maybe not. Did I just say Airbnb?
Yes, you did.
Oh my gosh. Oh boy. The B&B owner, or manager, whatever she might be, something like that, maybe, fairly playful, but like what he does to Nancy is not great. Like that, no, he knows that it doesn't really matter, but it's kind of gets to the point of, even if you knew it didn't matter, is that something you would still be okay with doing?
Yeah, I think you're right, and we'll discuss that in a bit more detail in the next loop.
Yeah, I might be jumping the gun there a little bit, but
you do get a sense right now that these are just NPCs, and in the morning he woke up actually excited because he spent the previous night in jail, and then he woke up basically freed from the consequences of his driving around recklessly on the train tracks getting chased by cops.
Yeah, he's actually like, oh, this could actually be kind of fun.
That's pretty much all my notes for this day. Did you have anything else that you wanted to talk about?
The only other thing that I jotted down that I was going to mention, and this is more of just a side note, but I love the YouTube channel Binging with Babish, and if anyone's not familiar, he recreates food items that are featured in movie and TV shows, and he made a cake, like a angel food type cake with the pink frosting, like the one that
Phil stuffs in his
mouth. And I feel like that came out not too long ago, and when I saw that, I really didn't remember the context of the scene. So it was kind of funny and cute to actually see it play out.
Yeah, and that does remind me of one other little tidbit, behind the scenes tidbit, was that, a lot of times in movies, whenever there's scenes with the actors eating, they usually try to eat as little as possible. But here, you see him stuff the entire cake in his mouth, and I believe it was from the director's commentary on the Blu-ray of this movie with Harold Ramis. But he said that in these takes, Bill Murray was actually eating a lot of the food that you see in front of him, so much so that he made himself sick by the end of the day.
I bet. Especially if they had to shoot a few takes of that cake slice scene. If he wasn't, spitting that out afterwards, that would make you queasy pretty quickly.
Yeah. And then I do have one other question for you before we wrap up this loop. I feel like this is a good time to ask you. Phil obviously is trapped in Groundhog Day for a long time, but there's only 36 days that we see on screen, but there's obviously a lot more days that we don't see. How long is your estimation of how long Phil was trapped?
So, after watching this, my husband and I had a very long conversation debating how long this whole movie would take place over. And I read a couple things of what Harold Ramis has said and what other people have calculated, which seemed just too high for me to wrap my head around. I mean, to me, like, without thinking too deep into it, I would think that this took place in like a 1 to 3 year span of his life. But given like some of the skills that he did develop, it could be, longer than that. But I just can't imagine someone living through this for like more than like, 5 to 10 years without like just going completely insane. Like, I just can't imagine that someone could go decades through this.
Yeah, that would be a tough thing. I mean, there are different ways that you can change up a day that's everybody else is doing exactly the same thing. But yeah, it would be tough after a while. Just the repetition. I mean, for people like the two drunks, people's everyday repetitions, you live different days, but not much changes. That can get to people after a while too. But yeah, to live literally the exact same day, it would be maddening after a while. I could see that.
Yeah. And maybe part of it is just me being sympathetic in that I hate to think of someone being stuck for decades. Like, that is just such a depressing thought to me that I just hope that wasn't the case.
Yeah, that's a good place to end this loop. But I'm going to have you back here on the next episode, but for everybody else at home, why don't you go ahead and let everybody know where they can find you and your work online?
So I am part of a website called French Toast Sunday. You can find us at FrenchToastSunday.com, and we have lots of archives of writing on our blog, as well as over 300 episodes of our podcast. So check us out there.
All right. And I am Bubbawheat, and you can find me and this podcast at flightstightsandmovienights.com, where I also have written reviews on over 500 different superhero and comic book movies. And you can find this podcast, It's Time to Rewind, on anchor.fm, as well as a variety of other podcasting services. And I will be back on the next episode. Just remember to be kind. It's time to rewind.
I'm a god. Well, what if there is no tomorrow? I'm a god. There wasn't one today.
The wretch concentered all in self. Living shall forfeit fair renown, and doubly dying shall go down to the vile dust from whence he sprung, unwept, unhonored, and unsung. Sir Walter Scott.